Najważniejsze transmisje sportowe masz teraz na wyciągnięcie ręki. Pobierz darmową aplikację TVP Sport. Link znajdziesz w opisie.
Just to start with the biggest point, do you consider yourself the greatest MMA commentator, and just skip all the humility and just say it from your heart? What do you think?
Well, could you imagine though, if 12 years into my career as a UFC commentator, I guess I'm probably 20 years in, but my man, could you imagine if I sat here and said to you, even humbly, that yes, I consider myself the greatest mixed martial arts commentator of all time? Certainly, I do not consider myself that. Now, I have always aspired to be great, and I think later in my life, I have leaned into things like maybe I have some natural ability as an orator, maybe I have some natural talent that has allowed me to realize success in this industry. But I work very hard at my craft, and I do desire to be the best. Now, Joe Rogan fuels a lot of public perception with what he says on his podcast. So sometimes if he refers to me as the greatest of all time, sometimes that can be something that the masses latch on to. I still feel like I'm developing. I still feel like there's room to get better in any number of different areas. I'm constantly trying to figure out areas that I can hone in on my preparation and make it a little bit more efficient. I think Jim Lampley is probably the greatest combat sports blow-by-blow guy that I have ever listened to. I think there have been a lot of great ones as well. I've always been a big fan of Mauro Ranallo. When it comes to the analysts, I think Joe Rogan is the greatest of all time, and I'm not even sure there is a close second. I think Rogan's combination of personality and diction and comedy and martial arts knowledge and appetite puts him on a level by himself. But I appreciate you even asking the questions, and hopefully one day, you know, when I reflect back upon the totality of my body of work, I'm at least satisfied with what I put out there.
Okay, thank you. Fingers crossed for you in that matter. But I wonder, when did it start? I read that you somewhere mentioned that you saw the first UFC event in 1993, but then you skipped like about 50 or 60 of them. So did you feel, maybe weren't you feel drawn by this sport at the beginning?
Well, I was certainly drawn in 1993 when I saw UFC 1, and I was invited to a party in Newton, Massachusetts to watch it. And it was incredible. It was certainly a spectacle, but I think at that stage of my life, I was more interested in playing basketball and chasing girls than I was in devoting my life to martial arts or being a mixed martial arts fanatic. I didn't grow up in a boxing household, right? It was always the Celtics, the Bruins, the Red Sox, the Patriots. We didn't really watch a lot of combat sports growing up, but I absolutely loved it. And then come 2004, I was a little bit older. I saw UFC 50, and that's when the appetite started to increase a little bit. And then, as you probably read or heard, I covered my first mixed martial arts event in the great state of Mississippi in 2007. And from that point on, nothing would ever be the same for me as a sports fan and as a sports broadcaster. But yeah, I guess it was a little bit of a slow roll for me at the beginning.
I see. So when you started covering this sport, when I was interviewing like 2 or 3 years ago, Bruce Buffer, he said that ever since he saw the UFC, he thought that that would be the greatest sport in the world in some future. And he was so convinced about it, even when it was banned in so many states. Did you feel the same way?
Yes. I mean, the difference, I think, is that he's a little bit older than I am. So when I first saw the sport, I was 15 years old, and I didn't have the maturity, nor the foresight, nor the wisdom at that point in time to look at the sport as such. But I don't know that I could paint any clearer picture for you than to suggest that I left ESPN, the worldwide leader in sports, a few years after I got there, and hitched my professional wagon to the UFC in mixed martial arts. So I don't know that I could give any greater proclamation about my belief in the sport than the fact that I left the destination I was trying to get to, ESPN, to chase this mixed martial arts dream and to be with the UFC. So I certainly felt like it had the potential to be the greatest sport in the world. I will always put the NFL and American football on a pedestal, but I definitely shared a vision with Bruce Buffer that the UFC could certainly be a mainstream sport in America, if not the greatest, biggest sport in the world.
Yeah, I see. So when you started working with the UFC, for the UFC, not in the ESPN, as you mentioned, it was announced in 2011, I think, yeah, 2011, and then the first event you covered was in the January of 2012, yeah. So how much of pressure did you feel, and at the first event, and then when you started to working alongside Joe Rogan instead of Mike Goldberg?
Well, it's a good question. And I will tell you, it was more about pressure than it was any nerves going into that first show. I had called season 1 of Bellator Fighting Championships back in 2009. And I was freaking out when I got that assignment because I had never called mixed martial arts before. I had only called boxing. So I had some confidence going into the UFC. But I did feel a lot of pressure because people are reticent to change in any walk of life. And for years, the only people that UFC fans had heard call fights, and UFC executives for that matter, were Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg. So this was an entirely different flair and flavor. And even as much as UFC President Dana White wanted me and Kenny Florian to be ourselves, there was just a lot of pressure to not take away from the live event. I even tell you in our interviews prior, we're just trying to be as listenable as possible for 8 hours, right? So yes, I definitely felt the pressure. And as I got the opportunity to call bigger shows and work with Joe Rogan, I felt a different kind of pressure. But I think when that moment arrived for me in 2017, I was so goddamn ready to be the #1 guy in my own mind that I didn't really necessarily feel pressure. With the exception of that first show, UFC 208. I will tell you, I'm not sure I've said this publicly. When I was riding over to the arena in Brooklyn, New York with Daniel Cormier before UFC 208, I expressed some nerves to him on the van ride over. And to this day, I'm just so thankful that he was the guy that I was riding with, because he was very dismissive of my nerves. And he was like, dude, are you kidding me? You're the best. You were born for this. You were born to be a broadcaster. And his words really resonated with me and allowed me to be at ease. But I feel pressure every show. I'm not nervous for every show, but I feel the pressure to perform every show.
So, of course, I don't remember these times. I was following UFC MMA, but I wasn't as active on Twitter as I am today. So I don't know, how was the response from the American public when you replaced Mike? He's such a known guy for biggest events, big legendary fights, and he has some catchphrases like "it is all over" and "so you wanna be a MMA fighter or ultimate fighter." Did you meet some criticism when that happened?
Yeah, it didn't really have to do with the guy that I was replacing or the guy that I was now working alongside. It just had to do with the fact that people were reluctant to embrace that change to whatever degree. I mean, I remember UFC President Dana White calling me into his office in Vegas a few weeks before my first show. And he just said, your haters are going to go through the roof. Your public approval rating is great until you crack a mic for us in Nashville. And then there's going to be this avalanche of haters, not just fans, but media members and other types who used to be your friends, who are maybe envious that you're getting this opportunity, right? You can count on one hand the number of guys who have called UFC fights, right? It's a very select group of guys who have had this play-by-play opportunity. So I didn't necessarily feel that I had to do anything stylistically that was different or come up with any catchphrases, but I just had to be myself. And at the time, I wish I knew how much time I had to give it to just allow people to marinate in that change, accept it, and then focus on the fights and the work itself that I was doing. And I think once the focus of the masses was in the right place, they recognized that I really put the fighters at the forefront. I would put my work ethic up against anybody in the space. And hopefully that's reflected in the broadcast and to a lesser degree, my public approval rating over the years.
Okay, so you just mentioned work ethic, and you are known for making tons of notes, handily written. So I wonder, how does the whole process of preparing to fight during the fight week looks from your perspective?
Well, it's a good question and probably a good time for you and me to be talking, because as I sit here on Thursday, April 27th, this begins my pay-per-view preparation for Saturday, May 6th. So depending on whether or not I'm in a back-to-back situation with a fight night the week before, thankfully that is not my reality this week, I'll start about 10 days out. I'll voice the entire pay-per-view today or tomorrow. I'll start to collaborate my old notes, put them together with my new notes, print out all the fighter bios, transfer some of the new information onto the new card. And it's a sprint essentially over the next 10 days. A lot of what I do to prep for the Anik and Florian podcast will help me with prepping for the pay-per-view. But everybody does it differently. The first order of focus for me is the fighters. Certain things have to be done, like the voiceovers have to be done 10 days in advance. But for me, I focus more on the fighters than the show formatics, as I sit here talking to you about 2 weeks out. And we have 28 fighters at UFC 288. So once I feel like I'm in a pretty good space when it comes to learning the fighters, watching film, collaborating my notes, then I can focus on show formatics and writing pay-per-view copy and copy for the show. But it's unlike any exercise really in professional sports. So much goes into 1 8-hour telecast. And I'm really not sure there's a point of comparison in all the professional sports, except for the Super Bowl itself, which is a 6, 7, 8-hour broadcast.
Yeah, I see. So do you keep all of your old notes in your house? And if so, how many of them do you have, and how does it look in your house?
So I wish I was in my home studio upstairs right now. I have a little bit of work being done up there and it's dusty, but I probably have about 5,000 or 6,000 fighter cards upstairs. Now, when Jan Błachowicz fights next, I will go into my library, and because he's a former champion, I might have more than one Jan Błachowicz card saved. Maybe towards the end of his career, I'll sign the back of one of them and give it to him or frame it for him, right? But let's just take Jan Błachowicz. I'll take the last fighter card I created for Jan, and I'll put that on the back of my new card. Then I take the UFC-generated fighter bio. I start my Jan Błachowicz fighter card. And then I will consult my old notes to see if there's anything important. I might have Jan Jr.'s birthday on my old notes. So now when I sit down with Jan Błachowicz, I don't have to ask him how old his son is because I already have that information, right? Then that particular old card, I will either repurpose to give away to a fan, or don't tell Bruce Buffer this, I'll throw it away because I just can't keep everything. Unlike Bruce, I can't take the entire stack of cards at the end of a show and donate it to charity because, as I just mentioned, I need my old notes, whereas Bruce doesn't. I could take a picture of my old notes and digitize it, but at least right now, the way my system is, I need my old notes as I prepare for the next fight.
Okay, so I'm curious because you just said that you try to focus on fighters, and how much of your focus is on the previous fights, and how much do you watch? How many of previous fights, for example, do you watch? And maybe how much do you focus on, for example, social media to see what are they doing in their lives currently, to get something from not a fighter but a people perspective?
It's a great question, and I'm sure you can relate to this as you prepare for your interviews. There's so much information out there, bro. Like if our broadcast got delayed 5 hours because there was no power in the arena, I'd be able to make use of that time, right? As you would be as well, right? There's always more film that you could watch. There's always one more social media profile that you could scan to try to find that great nugget that's going to help you either when you're writing copy for a locker room bump or when they're walking out to the octagon. So for me, it's a mix. If I don't have a show the week before, that means I'm going to have a chance to watch a lot more film. Oftentimes what I'd like to do, and Brian Stan, my former broadcast partner, taught me this, I'll watch their last fight, but then I'll also go back and watch one of the earlier fights in their career, maybe their UFC debut, so I can try to see some of their evolution from, say, UFC debut to UFC fight number 7. And then really reading articles and watching interviews. As I've said to you, there have been times where I've stumbled across an interview maybe that you've done with a fighter, and those conversations that journalists, especially video journalists, have with fighters are a huge part of my preparation. Oftentimes when you see videos on YouTube of prelim fighters and it says like 42 views, I'm 3 of those views right here, 3 views. So
okay,
that's a little lens into my preparation.
Yeah, that was another part I was interested in because I wonder, every fight week, of course, you have these meetings with fighters. Yeah, I know how it looks, but what's the difference between sitting down with the fighters you know so well and you've covered, I don't know, 5, 10 of their fights, and the new guy in the company, like, I don't know, Paul Rosas Jr. Or someone like that, yeah?
Yeah, another great question out of you. So it is different based upon each athlete. And oftentimes we are talking to these fighters on Thursday, right before they go to a press conference or they begin their weight cut for Friday morning. So you might interview a fighter 2 weeks out and you might extract a whole lot more juice out of that athlete than I can 2 days before the fight. Sometimes I'll have a fighter walk into a fighter meeting setting and they're so damn sucked out that I can tell we're not going to get very much, and I'll keep my questions pretty brief. But certainly in a broad scope, there's more value in sitting down with a UFC newcomer that's willing to reveal all than to sit down with a long-reigning UFC champion. And I would sit here and say to you, Israel Adesanya is probably the fighter we have sat down with the most. And we kept it very brief this last time out leading into the Alex Pereira fight. And we were able to get a few nuggets that we were able to use on the broadcast. But by and large, the fighter meetings that have the most value are the UFC newcomers. And I would also say that the women are more talkative than the men in general.
Okay. And would you see any difference between heavyweights who don't have to make weight in most of the occasions and some other fighters that are just during this process, and of course they might be not in the mood to talk to do anything less than they have to do?
Yes, Valentina Shevchenko long has talked to us about managing her energy during fight week. And that means managing her energy on media day, at the press conference, and even in the fighter meeting. And I think it's wise. I like the fact that she doesn't give us a whole lot in the fighter meetings. If we ask a good question, perhaps we'll get some great revelation. But by and large, Valentina Shevchenko is short-winded. She keeps things very close to the vest. And I can understand why. It's not going to help her in the fight to be super long and verbose with us 48 hours out. One other guy I would like to bring up with you who's headlining here in a couple weeks, Jailton Almeida. We've seen him as a heavyweight in our fighter meetings predominantly. He's like the most thoughtful guy ever, and he's doing it in a second language. He always gives us so much that I'm running out of space on my fighter card because he gives us so much. Were he to be competing at light heavyweight, maybe he would give us a little less. Absolutely, there are some fighters who come in and you can tell it's going to be a brutal weight cut, and I try to read the situation well and respond as such.
So how would you describe your relationships with the fighters? Because I know I don't know, but I assume that you are trying to be as just to and fair to everyone. But I guess there are some guys who you personally not during the event, right? I'm not talking that you are biased when you are commentating, but personally you like more, and there are some guys that you just don't get along. Is it a case for you?
Yeah, you are asking some tremendous questions today, my man. So that is my greatest pride and joy. The thing that gives me the greatest joy in this job is developing relationships with fighters and doing right by them on the broadcast. And I feel like overwhelmingly I have a great relationship with this roster. I have gone to great lengths. I have spent so many hours and so much energy over the years trying to develop relationships with this roster, even the lower profile fighters, even just something as simple as commenting on their Instagram page. Because whether I like it or not, I am omnipresent when it comes to this sport and this company. I'm one of the forward-facing individuals. I broadcast more live events than anyone essentially other than Bruce Buffer. And the UFC fans and the fighters see me whether they like it or not, at least right now. So when I go on an Instagram page of a losing fighter who fights the first prelim of the night and I comment, I think that can really resonate with an athlete. So I try to develop relationships with as many athletes as humanly possible. Certainly there are going to be some fighters that take issue with things that I do or say. And there are times, even in a setting like this, talking to you, where I'm asked for my opinion and I'm asked to analyze and I'm asked to editorialize, and I'm okay doing that. I try to do it diplomatically, but you experience this maybe to a lesser degree, but you get it. there are people who aren't going to be happy with your every utterance. And not a show goes by where some fighter or some coach or some fan isn't upset with something. But overwhelmingly, I stand by my work. I stand by most of what I say. And if there's reason to apologize, or if there's constructive criticism out there, I am more than willing to take the criticism or apologize if need be. And even the fighters who maybe have refused to do a fighter meeting with me at times, or have come out against me publicly like Colby Covington, I still believe those athletes will grant me a fighter meeting in the future. They will allow me to call their fight, right? It's not as though Colby Covington is going to the UFC and saying, hey, I don't want Jon Anik calling my next fight, right? Then I'd have a problem. So I take it very seriously. And in closing on that question, I would just say the greatest part of this job for me is when a fighter maybe approaches me after they've won a title and they appreciated the championship call. I had a moment like that with Leon Edwards recently, and I'll never forget it.
It looks like you are just going ahead of not one, but 2 or 3 questions that I have in my mind. So the first one is, in your opinion, are the fighters overly sensitive regarding the commentators?
I think the coaches are more sensitive than the fighters. I feel like everybody has a right to have their name heard. And sometimes when I've gone back and forth with coaches, I've said, hey, man, we got 28 fighters tonight, and they all have 3 or 4 in the corner. So you're talking about essentially 90 people in the corner that could get a mention. Never mind parents and children and anybody else who might comprise a support system for a given fighter. So I don't think fighters are overly sensitive. I think professional athletes are constantly in the public eye, and a lot of these athletes are very young and they're still coming into their own as far as their wisdom and their maturity. But I don't know that they're overly sensitive as a group. We are charged with providing the soundtrack of their professional lives, and I would be sensitive about it too. You know, if I'm watching a fight back and maybe I feel like I checked a kick and a commentator said, oh, nice leg kick. And it's like, bro, didn't even fucking land, you know? So I don't think they're overly sensitive. I think that some fighters are more sensitive than others, but I respect the sensitivity. How's that?
I get it. So I've read your comments on Colby, so I don't want to dwell into this topic, but I wonder, were there any fighters maybe from the past that you really had some issue with?
Fighters that I've had an issue with in the past? Not really. I mean, I've had fighters approach me privately about things that have been said on the broadcast. And I would say less than a dozen in terms of fighters. If you include coaches, it's more than a dozen. But I would say less than a dozen fighters over the years have approached me and taken issue with things that I have said, you know? So we're not batting 1,000, but I think overall we're doing pretty well. But I can't sit here, and it's not that I wouldn't name names, but I can't sit here and tell you that there's been any fighter that has taken great issue with me. You know, I love Tony Ferguson, and at one point on a fighter meeting, I'll peel back the curtain for you a little bit here, he said something like, all right, fucking Anik, you know, is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? Anik doesn't even want to fucking be here. And I was just like, oh my gosh, man, like, I love Tony Ferguson. So that really upset me. And we were able to bury the hatchet thereafter, and we're thick as thieves, tighter than ever again. But that upset me at the time because I felt like I was pretty close with Tony, and that really upset me at the time. But no, I feel like my effort has been there consistently with all of these fighters. And I feel like I've spent 12 years trying to lay a foundation as somebody who's respectful and just trying to put the fighters first. Even in the Colby Covington situation, you know, I had to put his criticism of maybe something that I had done or said before any threat, right? So I've constantly tried to put the fighters first. And I think that's why I haven't had as many fires to put out that maybe you'd expect.
Okay, I get it. And this might be a harsh question, so you can take a fifth on that and just decline the answer. But can you sometimes put away the stuff that fighters are doing in their private life? I mean, like things, for example, John Jones. I don't have to mention how many of troubles he got into, and other fighters. So is it hard for you to cross that, toss it out of your mind during commentary?
Well, I would say in a lot of respects, it's a case-by-case basis. But I would also tell you that I am a promoter more than I am a journalist, right? I don't work for ESPN except on the post-fight show. I work for the UFC. And so if Jon Jones returns to competition and the UFC, from a live production standpoint, wants to lead the telecast by talking about his transgressions and talking about some of the reasons as to why he has been out of competition, then I will execute that vision. You know, sometimes I feel like nationally, as far as the media is concerned in the United States, maybe too much is made of some of what Jon Jones has done. Now, that might be the minority opinion, but I am basically executing a vision of the UFC. And certainly I feel like there have been times where we haven't leaned into some of that stuff enough, especially when it happens very close to a fight. But by and large, we do focus on the in-octagon stuff. And I guess that's for better or for worse, right? But I think the most important thing you can pluck from my answer is that I work for the UFC and I execute their vision. And by and large, we don't sort of drag down the broadcast with that as much as maybe some people think we should.
Yeah, that's understandable. So when yesterday I mentioned on Twitter that I will be interviewing you, and I asked people if they had some question for you. And one that was mentioned like 2 or 3 times are the advertisements during the event. And the question is, do you remember about every damn advertisement, like round 3 is brought to you by P3 and something like that? Or you have producer and he's just telling you now it's the time to say something about Toyota or some movie and go on?
So I have a little bit of freedom to try to get a promo in, right? They might say to me, hey, we've got a UFC store promo if you can squeeze it in. And so I'll try to find a window to squeeze that in. Sometimes you might hear me leverage the clock and say, oh, nice elbow there, 3 minutes to go on the round. UFCstore.com is your source for it, right? So I try to make it as seamless as possible. I also would like to apologize to the masses. I understand certainly on certain pay-per-view nights, there is more commercial inventory than others. On a Conor McGregor pay-per-view, you're going to hear a lot of advertisements, and that's just the way it goes. That's the price we pay to not have commercials. So I do try to read them as cleanly and as expeditiously as humanly possible so we can get back to the live action. But it's kind of just the inconvenient truth of a pay-per-view with no commercials. A lot of that copy is committed to memory. I'm not sure that I'll ever need another Modelo cue card as long as I live, but I do have handheld cards, and I also have an electric monitor, sort of like a big screen, like an iPad, where a lot of the copy populates. But it is what it is, man. Some of those pay-per-view nights, I feel like I'm a walking advertisement, but I'm just doing my job, you know. I'd like to just be calling a fight too, believe me.
Okay, I think we are running out of time, so I will try to squeeze as many questions as I can during this few minutes. When did you come up with the one last night catchphrase? Because I don't know the origin, so if you can share it with me, I would be grateful.
Well, the only reason why I know the first time I uttered "one more sleep" is because when we went about trademarking it here in the United States, we had to find my first usage of it. So it was the night before a UFC weigh-in in 2016, and I tweeted out "one more sleep," and then I just started doing it, and people started to latch on. And now you see, I think a lot of sports leagues that aren't the UFC, the night before their big events, are stating "one more sleep." And, you know, it's flattering to whatever degree that people associate me with it. We've started to sell merchandise, which is just sort of a fun thing and a way for me to connect with the fans. But the origination was just a tweet in 2016, and it really started to take off. Not unlike "Don't Text and Drive." When I was at ESPN back in 2008, I would close every broadcast with, you know, for Kenny Florian, Rashad Evans, and Molly Karam, I'm Jon Anik. We'll see you next week. Until then, don't text and drive. And I just said that one day on a whim, filling time to try to hit the post at the end of the broadcast. And I got back to my cubicle, and my boss said, you should go with "Don't Text and Drive." So it kind of originated organically, and it had some legs, so we ran with it.
Okay, the next question that was also mentioned several times. what are your greatest moments as a commentator? I guess Leon Edwards must be one of it because you mentioned it in London. But are there any others as memorable as this one?
Well, you and I have talked in the past about when fighters break through and become champions for the first time, whether it's Leon Edwards or Alexa Grasso or Rose Namajunas or Jan Błachowicz. You know that I married into a Polish family. That's not why we're talking today, but I'm particularly happy with the Jan Błachowicz championship call because it's not special the what I say, but maybe the why. Poland, your guy got it done. I didn't think for a second that that's what I was going to say, but he was the first and is the only Polish male champion in the UFC. Poland, your guy got it done. Like, holy shit. Poland, your guy got it done. So that one is special to me. Rose Namajunas, when she broke through. Brandon Moreno. It's hard for me to think about other calls. Edson Barboza, when he knocked out Beneil Dariush. Henry Cejudo, message sent when he became the champion. But for the most part, it's hard for me to think beyond those UFC fighters who become champions for the first time, because those are the most special moments for me as a UFC fan. Okay,
I see. So the last one, like normal question, I have a round of just yes or no, but I will leave it to the end. Just for the Polish fans, I know that we spoke about it, that you are a fan of KSW and you were following this federation for some time. Do you have time to still be to know what's going on then?
Unfortunately not. We were talking on the Anik and Florian podcast this week about Patchy Mix, the Bellator champion or Grand Prix champion. And somebody said, oh, so is he fighting Sergio Pettis next? And I said, I think so, but I can't necessarily be sure because I'm not fully embedded in Bellator. And one of our viewers was like, dude, you got to be locked in on Bellator. And it's like, bro, I got to be locked in on 41 UFC live events and my 3 children, with respect, right? And it did dawn on me that I'm not nearly the wide-ranging MMA fan that I used to be. I watched the PFL to support my guy, Kenny Florian. I watched the UFC for obvious reasons. When it comes to KSW and Bellator and some of the smaller promotions, I just don't have the time. As much as I regret that statement, that's the God's honest truth.
Okay, so we have a big event now on June 3rd. It will be in Warsaw on the National Stadium. So there will be, I guess, over 50,000 people. Maybe you can just have some time to come by for a weekend in Warsaw. That will be great.
I would love it. Well, I really do hope at some point to get over there. And I can only dream that there's a UFC live event in Poland that I get assigned to. But at some point, my family, we will take our 3 children over there. It just might be a while.
Okay, if you need a tour, let me know. You know who to write. So just to finish this, there is just some kind of play I did on Twitter at the beginning of the year. Now it's the 2nd edition, let's call it. It's called Mystic Mac, when I just put some questions what will or won't happen during the year. So there are, of course, few questions regarding UFC, and I would like to ask you, what do you think? What if something will happen or won't? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So just let me read it. Will Jan Błachowicz fight for the title this year?
No.
Okay. Will Mateusz Gamrot break into top 5 at lightweight?
Yes, I think he will. I think he will. He's got to get the right matchups, but I think he has time to do it. And I certainly believe in him, the fighter. Yes, he will.
Okay. Will Conor McGregor fight this year?
Yes. Unequivocally, yes. Come on, Conor. Don't make me look bad.
Okay. Will Islam Makhachev lose lightweight belt this year?
So that I can't answer, because if I say no, then it's too predictive for my next call. Let me just say, I think whoever he fights for the lightweight championship, even the streaking Beneil Dariush, that fighter is going to have to fight the perfect fight to beat Islam Makhachev, much more so than Islam's going to have to be perfect to win.
Okay, I see. Will Ilia Topuria break into top 5 at featherweight?
Yes.
Can I ask you some questions about Bellator? Is it okay for you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Will Yoel Romero become light heavyweight champion?
No.
Okay. Will we see at least 3 light heavyweight title fights this year? We had already one, as you know.
No.
Okay. Will Weili Zhang fight for flyweight title this year?
I was hopeful that that would happen, but now that the belt has changed hands, I feel like it's pretty safe to say if Zhang Weili challenges for the flyweight title, it's going to be 2024 or later.
Okay. Will UFC have at least 4 events in Europe?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, for sure.
Will Shavkat Rakhmonov break into top 5 at 170?
I don't know. His manager tells me he's healthy, but he's got to get the right fight that's going to be involving a top 5 guy. So I would say he only fights one more this year, and it might be against somebody outside the top 5. So I'll say no.
Okay, and the last one, it's an open question. Who do you think will be pound for pound #1 at the end of the year? If you can say your thoughts.
So who is #1 right now? Is it Alexander Volkanovski?
Right now, yeah. Officially, yes. No. I think Jon Jones right now is #1, yeah?
So I will say Jon Jones. And that's not to suggest that he beat Stipe Miocic necessarily, but because he is prohibitively favored to beat Stipe, 3-1 favorite, I'll say Jon Jones retains that throne. And I do believe Alexander Volkanovski was another name on the tip of my tongue, as was Islam Makhachev. But Yair Rodriguez is 1 of 1, and he's going to have something to say about Volkanovski's great reign this summer. But yeah, I'll say Johnny Bones Jones retains the throne by the end of the year.
Okay, and that would be it. Jon, thank you for your time. And I know it was way past 30 minutes, so I apologize for that, but I had a great time. I hope you too.
I enjoyed it as well, my man. Always good to catch up with you.